These people are getting ready to take a trip back into history. We're in Charleston Harbor, along the east coast of South Carolina. From here, ferries carry tourists out to visit one of our nation's most important Civil War sites, Fort Sumter.
Southern states are becoming very dissatisfied with the federal union. South Carolina is the first state to secede, and this is a direct response to Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860.
One of the Confederacy's first acts is to seize all the federal forts in the South. In Charleston, Union troops under Major Anderson are stationed at Fort Moultrie.
Fort Moultrie was in pretty bad shape. That fort had been built in 1809. It was only one level high.
In the middle of the night, the soldiers secretly rode out to Fort Sumter, which was still under construction.
Anderson and his men moved over here to Fort Sumter because this was the newest fort in Charleston Harbor. It's 3 stories tall. It is going to be a state-of-the-art structure by the time it's complete, and it's defensible, most defensible because it has a mile of water on all sides. So South Carolina militia units, should they want to attack the U.S. Army, are going to have to cross a mile of water first. Right now we are standing outside of the Sally Port, or the entrance to Fort Sumter. And what we are standing on is the Granite Wharf, and this is where Anderson and his men would have landed on the night of December 26, 1860.
For more than 3 months, Anderson and his men peaceably held the fort. Then, on April 12th, the Confederate General Beauregard gave the command to open fire. This is one of the weapons the Rebs would have used to bomb the fort.
This is a 10-inch mortar, which is a small cannon. It's usually used, it has a high trajectory, so it can be used to shoot over the walls of a fortification like Fort Sumter. And this is the same type of model that would have fired the first shot of the Civil War. So we're standing inside of a casemate here at Fort Sumter. A casemate is a gun room, so it just would have had one gun inside of it. And as you can see here today, we do have one gun inside of this casemate. This is a 42-pounder. It fired off a 42-pound cannonball, and it is likely that this cannon was here during the first bombardment of the Civil War. So it may have participated in that first bombardment. It might have been active from April 12th to April 13th, 1861, and it might have been firing back at Confederate forts in Charleston Harbor.
To give the huge cannons a wider range of fire, they're mounted on wheels.
Each cannon runs on what's called a traverse rail, and that's just how you move the gun side to side.
Anderson and his men held out for 34 grueling hours. People in Charleston watched the fighting from rooftops and along the harbor. A ceasefire was finally arranged. Lowering the U.S. flag, the Union soldiers were allowed to leave with honor. But the story of Fort Sumter didn't end there. It becomes the target of another, even more devastating attack. I'll tell you about that when Teen Kids News returns. After the Rebs forced the Union to abandon Fort Sumter, the Confederate flag flew over the fort. But as the tide turned in favor of the North, Charleston came under siege. Time and again, the Union tried to capture Fort Sumter, but the defenders wouldn't give up. The turning point finally came on July 18, 1863, when Union forces attacked Fort Wagner on nearby Morris Island.
And the 54th Massachusetts Regiment leads this attack. Now, 54th Massachusetts was untried in battle. They're an all-black regiment that was raised up in Boston.
It takes 7 attempts, but the Union finally dislodges the defenders. From Fort Wagner, they battered the Rebs into submission.
And they bombarded Fort Sumter for 22 months, beginning in 1863 and ending in February 1865. So it's a longest siege during the Civil War, the longest siege in U.S. military history. And they bombarded Fort Sumter so heavily from that point that they completely shot away the top 2 levels of the fort during that time. And this is all the damage that was inflicted on the walls between 1863 and 1865 by the U.S. Army while the Confederate Army was here. Wherever you see pockmarks on the wall, that's where projectiles would have bounced off the walls. You'll see some huge gaping holes there. That's where projectiles would have become embedded in the walls and then blown up. And then there are still projectiles stuck in the walls of the fort, which we can go and check out. We fly 6 flags over Fort Sumter, and the first one, the big one that we have up there, is the 50-star United States flag, our current flag. Now we fly 5 additional flags, and these are historic ones that would have flown over the fort during the Civil War. That's the same flag that flew here during the first bombardment of the Civil War from April 12th to April 13th, 1861. There are 33 stars on that. 7 states had already withdrawn from the Union in 1861, but they were kept on the U.S. flag that entire time, and that was the policy of Abraham Lincoln because secession was not recognized. To the right of that U.S. flag is the Stars and Bars. That is the first national flag of the Confederacy. In the middle is the South Carolina state flag. Now, to the right of that, you have the second national flag of the Confederacy, also known as the stainless banner, and that one became the national flag in 1863. That first national flag looked too close to a U.S. flag, so this one is not going to be mistaken for a U.S. flag. February 18, 1865 is when Charleston was reclaimed by the U.S. Army. That is when the Civil War ended in Charleston Harbor, and when that flag goes up, it signifies the end of the war. There are now 35 stars on the flag. 2 more states were added to the flag during the Civil War, which include West Virginia, which had seceded from Virginia to join the Union, and then there was also Kansas.
Although the U.S. Army made repairs, the fort never saw action again. In 1948, it became a national monument and is managed by the National Park Service. There's a museum with lots of interesting exhibits to tell you more about the history of Fort Sumter. And if you're interested in the history of baseball, here's an interesting piece of trivia.
Abner Doubleday, who has long been credited as the inventor of baseball, was stationed here in 1861. He was part of one of the 85 men who participated in the first bombardment. However, historians do not have any evidence that baseball was ever played inside of the fort. What is suspicious is that Fort Sumter is 5-sided. It's shaped like home plate is in baseball, and there have always been kind of rumors or legends that home plate was designed after Fort Sumter's shape.
Sounds pretty convincing to me. Here's another piece of trivia. After the North recaptured Fort Sumter, Major Anderson returned. He was given the honor of once again raising the U.S. flag over the fort. The flag he used was the same one he had been forced to lower in defeat 4 years earlier. For Teen Kids News, I'm Benjamin.